Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Dylan Hoffman PhD. Dylan completed his PhD at the Pacifica Graduate Institute and has recently become the co-chair of the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. So welcome, Dylan.
Thank you for having me, John.
Dylan, can we just start with a bit of a gossip? You've just recently in the last month become co-chair.
Yes.
Have you become really busy?
I have become really busy. Everybody warned you about taking on administrative roles or leadership roles, and their warnings are
all proved to be correct.
Based on their experience of what actually happens, of meetings and paperwork and things like that, and I'm sure I'm only beginning to taste it. But yes, it's a new realm of learning new ways of navigating academic space for sure.
Dylan, I've been looking forward to having a chat to you because I think there's this thing of archetypal psychology and Indigenous culture and the similarities, the connection between the two. And I'm hoping that we can maybe get there in our conversation. But I wonder whether you could just tell me about your beginnings. You live in Colorado, right? And
I do.
Cortez, is it, in Colorado?
Yes. Correct.
And I wonder whether you can tell me, because I think when we first chatted, you told me about your Pentecostal roots. So can you just chat a bit about that for a second?
Yeah. I was maybe even a bit of a backstory. My mother, who's Mexican, and my father, who's white, grew up in another small town in our area called Deloria. And my father's family has a mixture of Mormon and Pentecostalism even there, and my mother grew up Catholic. But as they grew up, religion was fairly nominal. They went with the family, so to speak, or for my dad, I think religion became a taboo topic altogether. But when they realized they were having kids, they decided, as sometimes happen, maybe our kids need to grow up in something, and participate in, have some sort of religious upbringing. So they ended up joining a little Pentecostal community in Cortez, and that was what I was born into. It just turns out that little community quickly, as I see it now, descended into almost a fundamentalism group that was viewed as extreme even by fundamentalist other groups. And we were on the fringes of even the Christian community. And what that translated into eventually was a very apocalyptic vision of the world, a waiting for Jesus to return in the moment. It meant complete isolation from the surrounding community and world. I wasn't allowed to go to dances, no secular music, television.
No Elvis Presley swinging his hips.
No. And so and again, I was born into that. So, that for me, that was, that's what we're doing. The world's about to end and we're just getting ready. That included what were called rapture calls, where a pastor would talk to parents, and in the middle of the night, they would drive around in a van and snatch the kids of the church away and throw them in the van and take them to the church and ask them if they were, if that had been Jesus, if they would have been ready. And it included a really harsh stance toward the body. The body was sort of the inhabitation of evil, the devil. So all instinct, sense was suspect. This also included a really stringent mental atmosphere, in the sense that the mind was also a playground for our fallen nature. And so you to think something was the same as doing the thing. So it really became suffocating. Even though I was deeply devoted to meeting the expectations of that community and living up to it, by the time I became a teenager, I was really suffering a dichotomy in my experience between sort of something going on in me and the person I was expected to be in the community. And I felt some sort of opposition in me to obeying the standards. There was just something in my mind, in my body, that
kind of an instinctual rebellion in a way.
Yes. And of course, I interpreted that for many, many years as, well, this is my battle with the devil, and I just have to try harder. But eventually I started really coming apart psychologically, even as I moved into training for ministry. I was almost like, my body was almost ceasing to participate in my life anymore. I would have difficulty breathing. I was in a profound state of depression. I know I would go days and days without speaking, even though I was around. I was just in a space where I couldn't communicate very much. And
how old were you then, Dylan?
Probably around 20, or early 20s. And it came to a point where I knew I was on some verge of something going really, really wrong, where I was going to need treatment or really break down. And I had no idea what might look like, but I knew I was losing my body, losing my mind. They were going in directions that I was resisting, and that tension was no longer holding together very well. And so I had a really sort of direct moment of whether I'm going to fight that fight anymore, or whether I'm going to learn to listen to this oppositional force in my life and take that as some sort of meaningful something that is telling me I can't do this anymore. And I don't even know where that thought came from as a possibility, but I think I was in so much pain that some other possibility just felt like worth walking away from everything I knew. And I just had a moment.
A lot of pressure from the community, the people around you, I presume.
Yeah, because walking away entailed an absolute sense of you've abandoned God, you've abandoned the truth, and that came with severing of friendships and breakdown of trust and
bit of
that kind of thing.
Outcast status as well.
Yeah. But I just decided at some point that I had enough of the breaking down, and I was just gonna try that other thing. And from there, trusting that opened up my life in dramatic ways, that it took years to unfold and pick apart a lot of those threads. And ingrainedness of that world that I grew up in. But that oppositional force that I felt like as this autonomous thing that had become so familiar and so painful became my way into depth psychology, ultimately, as an engagement with the soul that has intentions and structures and realities that we have to learn to negotiate with and partner and participate with in order to live the life we're supposed to. That was my entry point.
I can relate to it a lot because I went off to India when I when we were chatting initially. I went off to India when I was 21 or something. It's a different context, but the transcendentalism, I would take, it's maybe using a bit of jargon, but the superbia of the spiritual experience or whatever. And I found leaving was a bit like dying in a way, because I knew I had to leave, but it's kind of like, it's like having a midlife crisis early.
Yeah.
It's
very
like,
much so.
It's like I knew I had to, in a way, separate myself from the community, because there's something crazy about the spirit, but nevertheless, there's something incredible. It reminds me sometimes of, Manfred Mann had that song, Blinded by the Light. That
right.
There's this dazzling light or something, or experience, and one can't in a way argue with that, but then there's this call to a deepening maybe, but they're opposed.
Right.
I knew I had to separate, but it took me years to, like, I used to miss the community of people, the friends.
Yeah, I think maybe that's one of the most difficult things is both you are known, you have an identity in this community, you have a context, you have, and in my case, like a level of like absolute certainty, like whether it's oppressive or not, it's like, well, the world is this particular thing and that's the way it is. And so it siphons off a lot of the uncertainty that is required to go outside of that context. And that's tremendously difficult to give up. There's something addictive about that kind of sense of belonging and having the answers ready-made, that
belonging, certainty. It's a massive disillusionment, isn't it? Like,
yes,
I think Jung says that when about the midlife, like it's the disillusionment of ideals or belief structures or something. It's like losing them.
Yeah, and from in that framework, there's this sense of like, well, I was absolutely certain that this was the thing, and now sort of absorbing the reality that you can be absolutely certain and absolutely wrong, and and then that, but that's provided a lot of, I think, ease across other thresholds, knowing that I can take on a framework and feel very convinced in it. My initial experience of that, and I know that framework can also leave a lot out. And so I try to take that with me now, regardless of framework, to say, to not hold so dearly to any sort of developed orientation, because life can come out of the blue and say, you forgot about this.
Yeah. Big certainty. Well, Dylan, how did you stumble across Jung? How did that happen?
I think in seminary, I remember Jung being sort of the epitome of what not to do theologically, because he was presented as someone who said the divine could show up however it will, and religious symbols are ways that humans can contain or orient towards that, but that in themselves, they're fairly relative, which was, of course, anathema to fundamentalism. But when I sort of moved into that unknown space, he came to mind as someone that had articulated the possibility that the sacred can show up however it wishes, despite religious symbolism that you've inherited. So that became an initial way into a perspective that would allow me to make room for this other that I had lived with for so long, and allow me to experience the sacredness of it that had been demonized in this other context. That for me was what made depth psychology so rich, as not because it was necessarily sort of intellectually meaningful to me, which it was, but it provided an existential way for me to make it through this death.
Yeah.
I never had. Go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is, I can relate, but one thing I find interesting is that you never kind of thought of just throwing out the soul and the sacred. And like, I have met people that, left the group that I was involved in, and they kind of just went on the opposite side, if you want to put it that
right.
way, like go and make $1 million, or, take
right.
up the modernist project or whatever. But for me, that I didn't find that was really an option. It's somehow you have to take the kernel of the soul and the sacred and relearn it, or
right.
But it's like being blind and feeling your way.
Absolutely.
Wasn't.
Yeah, in a very strange way, like, I wasn't sort of in a place of making intellectual option choices. Like, I could become an atheist because I was a Christian, and I'm choosing against that now because of how experiential my experience was with this oppositional force. It was a power that I didn't have an option of denying. And so I couldn't just sort of make a decision to not believe certain things, even though there was that part of it. But the reality of the encounter with this other in my life was something I couldn't just dismiss. I had already done that and suffered from it.
Yeah. I remember, this is looking backwards a long way in retrospect. It's easy looking backwards.
Right.
But I remember reading in Jung once something about Gerald Dawn and the stages of the alchemical process, or something like that. And one stage was the uno mentalis, or I'm not sure,
right,
uni mentalis, and then the unus mundus. But it's like that, for me personally, I can kind of say, oh, I get, if you go to different islands, even like in the Odyssey, that the spiritual stage is sometimes, detached from the senses, purity. Right. It has something legitimate as well. And whilst I might say, the unus mundus or the anima mundi or something is more the place, but there were so many wonderful experiences as well. So in that way, I can feel.
Yeah. No, there is sort of multiple layers to the experience, because obviously at one level there is the intellectual framework, the beliefs, the things that have to be transformed. At another level, like, one of the principal things of this tension for me was my body itself, which sort of led the way, and then my then my mind could catch up with the experience. And then that absolutely changed my relationship with the world itself, which had been a space of absolute, let's get out of here as soon as possible. to a place that I experienced as inhabited, sacred, enchanted. And so there was definitely those layers present that didn't necessarily happen at the same time, but all were integral to making the journey as a whole, for sure.
So how did you get to Pacifica to study? How did that all happen?
Well, out of that experience, I started studying psychology, and I ended up studying, just to make sense, it was like, for me, of course, I got to start studying what this means. And so I ended up going to graduate school in New York at Adelphi University, which had a Freudian bent, but was generally depth psychological. And at that point in my life, I had thought that my option would be to become a clinician. And so I started exploring schools, but there wasn't a lot of Jungian clinical programs. And I sort of got a little disillusioned with the process, because there was also something in me that didn't necessarily want to be a clinician. But in that sort of decision process, I decided against going a clinical route and sent off applications for an MFA in writing. I thought, if anything, I can sort of write this out, or writing was always a vehicle for me of making sense of things. In that waiting process, which extended much longer than I anticipated, I started getting anxious about that. And out of the blue, and I don't remember if I had done some sort of late night graduate school binging online and asked for a bunch of catalogs, but while I was waiting to hear back from this MFA program, a Pacifica catalog landed in my mail. And as soon as I opened it up, I was like, well, this is the place for me. I ended up getting admitted to the clinical program at Pacifica and went to quarter to that, and really at that point realized that the clinical was not what I was in it for. I just really wanted to study depth psychology as a discipline. And about that same point,
that, isn't it? It's like it's a breed, clinical. I don't know, excuse my language, but it seems to me there's a breed of people that are like really clinical, and then the people that have interest in depth psychology in other ways. It's two different things.
For sure.
Two different callings.
Absolutely. And I even had my clinical advisor sat me down early on and said, why are you in the clinical program? And for me, I thought that was the option, so to speak. But he was like, Pacifica has recently opened up this other program that is like, you're studying Jung, Hillman, and depth psychology as sort of a discipline in itself. And I immediately said, well, then of course I'm hopping over. So give me 1 second. My daughter's stepping on me. Hey.
Yeah, Daddy.
I'm so sorry. Give me 1 second.
That's all right. That's okay.
Forgive me. We
Yeah,
had a long conversation of
the world always
yeah.
enters.
Yes. So that was, and then that's when I encountered the Jungian Archetypal Studies program, and from there it was like that's where I felt I was supposed to be.
And who was teaching there at that time, Dylan? Who were the main people?
Really, Glenn Slater, Saffron Rossi, Jennifer Seelig was chairing the program, Susan Rowland, almost all of whom are still there. Kieran LeGrice came in to take over the chair position in my 3rd year in the program. Otherwise, Kieran, Glenn, Saffron are still the core faculty, and I'm added to that group. So I'm working with the people that were my teachers, which is an extraordinary gift for sure.
And Dylan, I wanted to head towards, because I know when we were having a chat, I got the sense of your, what is it? Perhaps search for your heritage or
Yeah.
ancestors. So Indigenous culture. Did that happen earlier, or was that happening at about that same time that you went to Pacifica, or?
It had always been a thread in my life. Growing up biracial and in both families, you experience this otherness in whatever context you're in. And so it was always a prominent part of my identity and something that I didn't have a lot of information about. I grew up asking my Mexican grandmother about our immigration story, or where in Mexico are we from, and these kind of questions, but there weren't a lot of answers that I got, and so that sort of stirred me even more to sort of get into why no one knew these kind of things. And when I got into depth psychology, I think part of what's inherently involved in depth psychology is a recognition of the psyche itself being structured ancestrally, and carrying with it the experience, the patterns of humanity. And so that just added another layer of me wanting to understand that larger context for me. And it wasn't until I really met who's now my wife, who was really familiar with migrant communities in Colorado, whom she'd worked with, and she's fluent in Spanish. So she was having conversations with my grandmother and picked up on a kind of dialect of Spanish that's really unique to a southern Colorado, northern New Mexico area called the San Luis Valley. That sort of opened up a whole window of me learning that my family had been in Colorado until traces disappear. So 200, 300, 400 years in the area. That became profoundly meaningful for me to realize that there weren't stories about coming to the United States because my family had been here beyond the memory of my family. And it gave me a connection to my place. I was able to connect some dots, but it really gave me a sense of my own indigenous place to where I'm at. Then, in relationship to depth psychology, that profoundly changed my approach to teaching it, my approach to understanding it, in really significant ways.
So how, in which kind of ways, Don? I mean,
what it turned out to be for me is realizing that what I had learned as a depth psychological sensibility to paying attention to the world in particular ways, to recognizing its own animation, to the presence and reality of ancestors, to the recognition of dreams being meaningful, all of those things that are part and parcel of depth psychology. I realize that my own indigenous community carried a deep tradition of that as well. And so for me, it was a moment of realizing that depth psychology wasn't the sole carrier of other ways of knowing, and that it could itself learn from these larger traditions that have centuries and millennia behind them of engaging the world as an ensouled, enchanted, inhabited space, and the psyche being a meaningful communicator of ways of knowing beyond Western scientific empiricism that had, both marginalized those communities and marginalized those ways of knowing. And so at that point, I felt like I couldn't teach depth psychology without making the recognition of these larger traditions a part of what it means to engage with the world in this way.
Way before psychology, there were traditions
Yes.
into dreams, into myth, into stories, into... I mean, it's a bit ridiculous that we sometimes maybe forget that.
Yes. And the other side of that is it also gave me more layers of understanding how human beings have been able to live in a way that recognize that there are sort of spiritual archetypal givens in the world that I experienced in my own ways, but that is a way of operating that sort of asks relational questions about how to be in the world, rather than a colonialist assumption that all space is human space and available for consumption and ownership and possession, and sort of peels back and says we're participants, inhabitants, shared, interdependent persons in relationship to other persons. And that has enriched my life individually, and I hope how I talk about depth psychology.
What does it mean to be colonized, really? What does it mean?
In my perspective, it originates in an attitude that someone has the right to take possession both of your material space and your ways of knowing, to both do with them what they will, reject them, position them in relationship to value, to meaning, and in that way displace the worth of your contribution to the world. And therefore, in order to participate in a colonized community, you must become
a unit of production.
You must adapt to that framework in order to be considered a meaningful person in that context.
So in a way, just us being a part of modernity, when Jung talks about the rootlessness of modern life, it seems to me that sometimes it's like so much of the myth, the story, the guts, the groundedness, the interrelationships been lost. There's a kind of a dangerous rootlessness in modern life, just in general.
Yeah, I think that for most of us, it's simply the way the world is, that whatever isn't a human person, and in particular often a male white person, that the world belongs to them in some like inherent way, that should this be considered a value to the West, to this attitude, it's there for the taking. It's of course, that's how the world works, that everyone belongs to this thing and must adapt to what it finds useful, productive, and of value. And to consider that mindset is pathological feels like a radically threatening position to take,
it's the
because that's
official
just the way
narrative.
we think of it.
It's the
Sorry,
official
go ahead.
narrative. Well, it's the official narrative. So to call it pathological is a big leap.
Right. Because it is what normal means. But in many ways, this is why I find depth psychology of continual relevance, because it has a positionality to say what is conscious and normative can also exclude. And so it provides a language and reference point for calling out the normative in ways that the dominant culture assumes can't be done or shouldn't be done. And so to have something arise in the West like depth psychology as a counter, as a partner with indigenous ways of knowing, that can say, of course there's norms, and also those norms inherently are limited. Therefore, what have we left out of this way of speaking of and living in reality?
It's like there's a in my jargon, a dominant conscious position, but
yes,
the depth of the soul, the depth of the unconscious has much more to bring to the table, and
absolutely,
the what is it? The depth of history as well.
Right. And the beautiful thing about depth psychology is that the excluded is not inert. The excluded makes itself known. And so in symptomology, in protest, it happens individually, as I've experienced, and it happens culturally. And so I find deep comfort and encouragement in my own experience that this other doesn't remain silent, that the excluded eventually finds a way to voice itself in opposition to the exclusionary power. And I think that's why, for me, when we think of cultural breakdowns happening, sort of disruptions and disturbances, from the dominant cultural perspective, of course, those are threats. From a depth psychological perspective, those are the voices of the other emerging, breaking through. Yeah.
Can you tell us about a couple of people? I know, when we were speaking earlier, a couple of people that are perhaps, how would I put it, maybe versed in depth psychology and versed in Indigenous culture, and how they're going about it, maybe.
The person that that comes first to mind is Vine Deloria Jr. He's written a book explicitly as a dialogue with Jung and depth psychology. He is Sioux. He's passed. His son, I believe, is continuing on in many ways, carrying on his father's work in his own ways, of course. But Vine Deloria Jr. has this exceptional way to dialogue with others that is incredibly sharp in critique without being dismissive. And he finds places of communicative access between perspectives and is able to honor those and affirm those without idealizing depth psychology and without sugarcoating how it itself carries assumptions about the other, particularly the primitive. So I often have students note that when I assign his text of, here's someone that could potentially just be absolutely offended by certain language in depth psychology. And yet he has the spaciousness of humanity to say, if there's something in depth psychology that could be useful as conversation partner with what's going on in the world, that I'm willing to speak with that. And his work across the board is invaluable. But he's someone that has directly engaged with depth psychology from an Indigenous perspective, and is particularly valuable. The other person that stands out is Gloria Anzaldua. She is a what we'd call mestiza in the Mexican community. She's mixed as I am. And she talks about inhabiting multiple spaces, multiple cultures, multiple identities, and utilizes Jung and Hillman for inhabiting plurality and multiplicity.
She's got plurality in her paragraphs, Dylan. I read a little bit
Yes.
of, I'm not an expert, but what I got from her is there's this kind of sharp intellectual, but in the same paragraph, she's going back to old language. So she's mixing kind of intellectual language with really old language, all in the same thing, and it's interesting. Like, it's really,
yeah. No, her texts sometimes for students can be frustrating because she'll move from Spanish to English and evoke Mexican mythological figures and then talk about modern activism. But it's a really, for me, she embodies this, someone else who embodies this capacity to say what can be really useful for people who have these multiple spaces they're inhabiting, who have biracial or multiracial, who are experience marginalization, and yet want to converse in ways to break open more habitable spaces psychologically for people, and finds depth psychology meaningful to do that without, and bringing it into this space of multiplicity that doesn't eliminate the other voices in her life. So yeah, she's someone else that really choreographs and dialogues with multiple levels, with multiple spaces in really rich ways, and includes depth psychology in that process.
it's a liminal space going into one of her paragraphs. It's
Yes.
got past, present, future, like it'll take into liminal
Yes.
space.
And whenever I hear sort of objections to her texts and her use of Spanish and her sort of going in and out of territory, I like to say, well, like, what is your experience with the psyche? Does psyche ever just lay it out for you, or do you have to do some work to understand the language of psyche? And so inevitably we're put in a stance of having to engage with language that isn't necessarily immediately understandable to us. And so I often use that as a way of like, well, here is someone who is using language you may not readily understand, and yet if you can make the work psychologically to move into dream, to move into synchronicity, then that's that same capacity to inhabit new spaces, learn new languages, and therefore in the process find new psychological territory to inhabit.
So I'm wondering, after coming from the beginning of our conversation, beginning in the Pentecostal Church, exploring the Indigenous culture, how have your views changed? What is the religious experience? What is the sacred? How would you approach those things now?
I think there's been a through line from the point of me really trusting the force of that other in my life. And so I navigate my life and understand the sacred in relationship to my sense of it being an objective other in relationship to my intentions or plans to my life. And so for me, it shows up when something says no to me. Life as a whole, something in my body, something within me. And so for me, that's the whole world of, like, from the reality of trees and buildings and cars and all of that is something I have to take into account in my relationship with the world. And so I can't dismiss any of it as not relevant to how the sacred is present in the fabric of all of it. Because as soon as I fail to have that attitude, I trip over something. And it's sort of that place of reminding me I'm in relationship, and who I am and who I want to be has to take into account the autonomy, the givenness of the many other persons, places that I inhabit this world with. And so everything is that face of the sacred for me. My daughter, who barged in to our meeting, is me recognizing that I only have so much say in what it means to create plans or intentions in the world, and a lot of it is responding to how the world shows up and what it asks of me, and to be in relationship to it.
So is that the anima mundi as well? Could we say it's the same thing?
Yeah, I think that's in depth psychological terms, and in even larger tradition terms, that soul is as extensive and beyond of the world itself, that the world itself is soul, an expression of soul. And for me, that's another way of realizing that to be psychologically whole doesn't just mean this introverted or interior engagement with what's going on in me, but that being whole means being in relationship with all of the world too, and what it needs and what it is. Otherwise, I can tell myself I'm doing psychological work, but it's in isolation from the soul that exists in all the other things that exist.
Yeah, and beauty?
Same. For me, it's not something other to the ugly or the tragic or things like that, but the inclusive of everything. That for me, beauty means the perception, the recognition of each thing being what it is in where it needs to be. And so for me, that's what sort of an aesthetic sense, and having an eye for beauty is having an eye for
sacred, for the sacred as
yeah,
well. I mean,
for
they're
yes,
kind of
yeah, for me they're
same
synonymous.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, of everything having its place, nothing denied.
The shaman.
I tend to have a sort of both andness. I think the psyche itself inhabits multiple layers of perception, dimensions of the world itself, and therefore everyone in some way to be in relationship with psyche is in some way asked to make room for that multidimensionality of the world itself. And then I think there are people in particular communities that are really called and skilled at traversing that multidimensionality that allows for healing and interconnection between those multiple spaces that we are and that the world is, and
between worlds
and bridge those divides. Yeah.
I mean, I want to just ask you one question, Dylan. In terms of, like, there's a lot of, well, you have mentioned two books, but when we talk about shamanism, there's a lot of material being written now. Like, I've read a few, Dreaming with Open Eyes, or Robert E. Ryan. I remember reading him. Jung and Alchemy. Who do you like out of that? Who?
I think for me, I've it's not that I don't value the literature on shamanism, but what have begun doing is more valuing understanding the cosmology of Indigenous communities. There can be, this might be me attributing something falsely, but I think obviously Western individualism is having an impact on how these figures participate in their community and are being sort of isolated as this thing in itself, when really the medicine person, the shaman, is an embodiment, a navigator of a cosmology that the whole community participates in. And for me to understand the texture of that larger space makes each person in that community meaningful for what they do, in addition to the shaman's place in what they do. And so I have a tendency now to provide less
a little.
Yeah, because I think
we get swept away.
Indigenous,
ayahuasca, the shaman, or over-identifying maybe a little with that.
Yeah, because it becomes this other thing that I can be, and like a consumeristic, I'd like to be a shaman too, rather than realizing that in Indigenous communities, the person that's doing the harvesting or whatever role societal is equally essential to the well-being of the whole, and the shaman is medicine person is one of those, and not the sole carrier of the well-being of what it means to inhabit an inhabited world.
And not the most glamorous job, really, sometimes.
No, I assume not.
All those creative illnesses along the way, or whatever. Yeah. Oh, that's great, Don. Yeah, no, I wonder about your own writing. What are you? If there's callings for different things, do you have a lot of that calling within you?
I sort of follow that out daily. I mean, that's always because of because of my early experience and my sense of learning to follow the lead of what shows up. I tend to do that. And so that's how I got to depth psychology. That's how I got to Pacifica, is knowing that today I feel where like I'm where I need to be in relationship to my sense of being communicated to by the world and my own body, psyche. So teaching is a thread that I've just had no guarantee that something would open up. It did, and I trusted that, and that's what I'm doing now. So I don't try to project two things far ahead, but I do. I trust that daily pool and let it be what it is. I do feel particularly called to teaching and writing, but it's something that I've learned to not try to get ahead of, because when I force it, the flow dies. I cut myself off from something. And so I do hope to write on this topic of depth psychology and indigeneity. That's the most prominent thing that I feel like is on my horizon. But it's going to be in relationship to all these other things happening, but I think it'll get there.
Well, maybe that's a good place to leave it, Dylan. And I want to thank you very much for.
I really appreciate it, John. These conversations you hold with many are, I think, really rich and meaningful, and so I really appreciate you opening up this space and opening it up to me.